Throughout history, humans have always had one thing in common. We always want to kill each other. I'm Brandon, and this is Theaters of War. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this episode of Theaters of War. As I mentioned, I'm Brandon, and we are here to discuss one of the most important elements of warfare, and that's what's on your back during warfare, aka your clothes, your uniform, or your armor. Now, it goes without saying that every single documented conflict that we've had has had some form of clothing or uniform or armor involved, unless we go back way back to when prehistoric man and woman was fighting with a stick and a rock. But we're going to go through the history of uniforms, how they changed throughout history, why certain things were enacted, and why certain things fell out of favor over the years. So without further ado, let us begin with segment 1. The uniforms of warfare have a pretty long and storied history to them. But first, let us begin with what is a uniform? A uniform is used as a standardized piece of clothing or equipment that you wear that can easily identify and have distinctive features for the user. This could be distinctive to what nation you're fighting for, what role you fill, such as if you're a special operations unit, an aircraft pilot, part of the Navy, etc. And it is used as a sort of symbolic way of showing different forms of military attire. There's many different forms. There is the military dress, there is a full dress uniform, there's formal wear, there is service dress, combat uniforms, and these all serve different purposes, whether this be on the front lines fighting, during ceremonies, during more peaceful times. They'll have very different and a wide range of different applications. One of the first examples of true organized uniforms is, of course, the Roman Empire. Like many things in the modern era, Rome is known for their giant legions of fully armored units with their shields, all wearing their distinctive Roman red and their distinctive iconography of the Roman Empire. Now, different ranks in this period of time were also distinguished with many different types of clothing and different types of armor to distinguish how high on the pecking order they were. You had different units that would actually take different armor from the battles that they fought. The centurions, they had specialized armors and uniforms based on the conquests they went on. Different ranks had different cloaks and plumes to distinguish themselves. And Rome, as we know, is one of the most organized societies, at least militarily, in human history. So it goes without saying that they are quite extensive in their uniforms and their armor. Now, I want to clarify something quick before we proceed, but I've been using this term interchangeably, uniform and armor. And while they serve a similar purpose in terms of their dignifying and distinct approach, they have a very different meaning. Uniform is more of an aesthetic. It's more of regular clothing that identifies what you are as a soldier, whereas armor is more, it can be a uniform, but armor is for protection. It protects against swords, bows, crossbows, guns, etc. Now, as we move into the classical era and a little bit into the early modern era, this is really when the modern form of uniforms really comes into our mind. As we can see during this period, there are many developments in plate armor. As we can see, the Templars were known for their giant plate armors, their swords, their shields. They rode horses, and there was a very firm political importance to the armor, being knights, but there's also a large defense element to it, that the armor is useful for defending against basic weapons. Armor would advance more and more and more to be stronger and stronger metal. But as we enter the modern era, the form of plate armor and other metallic armors falls out of favor for something a little bit more realistic, more subdued. As we can see, many uniforms were almost artistic pieces showing the colors of a nation and really designating certain armies to have certain aesthetics. We all know the classic British redcoats, the Prussian blues. The Italians were big on green and blue. You had the French that loved blue and red. It was just an easy way to identify who you were fighting. In the 19th century, with more and more military advancements, a certain nation, the nation of Prussia, was known for their military organization and discipline, sort of the modern day Rome in that way, where they really innovated on that. And you can see here their transformation of uniforms relatively stays the same as the years go on, but of course, there are some advancements. The helmets get a little bit better. The pants and the smaller accent colors get a little bit less noticeable. They're more darker shades. And as we get to the end, we get to the Great War uniforms, which we will get to shortly. Another important thing about the early modern era for uniforms is during the American Civil War, it's quite an overgeneralization that the Union were using blue uniforms and the Confederates were using the gray uniforms. This was somewhat true, but the consensus is that there weren't enough uniforms at the beginning of the war to give to both sides in order for them to use them. So as sort of the first early stages of sort of a civilian population fighting against another sort of civilian population, as much of the Union and Confederate forces were new conscripts, not veteran forces, they used the uniforms of their state or even of their city. And this would give them much more of a dignifying individual approach to their uniforms. Essentially anything that could be used as a uniform would be used as a uniform, which we would later see in many Civil War conflicts such as Spain and in Russia during the 20th century, which we will get to shortly. But this is really the first time that in the modern era, we had more of a militia civilian force that didn't really wear specific military uniforms for the purposes of ceremony or symbolism, such as with Prussia, the British, the French, etc. Now, as we leave the 19th century, moving into the 20th century, the era of modern warfare with the Great War, we have a very, very big change in how uniforms would be used. Now, in this era, we had the iconic French uniform of the time with the very bright blue tunics and the bright red trousers. Now, this was the standardization for uniforms for centuries, pretty much the entirety of the classical and modern era. But at the beginning of the 20th century, many nations started to phase this out for more practical fatigues. This first started with the British in the 1840s with their conquests and their exploration of India and Africa. They would use tan khaki fatigues in order to blend in with the desert and to have a uniform that could be dirty and not be frowned upon. It was not an ornate piece of clothing, rather, it was a practical piece of workwear. There are many different iconic colors from this era as well. We have the Prussian blue for centuries for Prussia, but as they entered World War I, they get into that grayish sort of slate color, and they look a lot more uniform now. Gone are the colorful uniforms of old, and now come the practical era of grays, blues, browns, and tans for our uniforms. This all changed relatively quickly. Many nations adjusted faster than others, as I mentioned, the British in the 1840s, but we have the Japanese and the Russians during their Russo-Japanese War. They had to change their uniforms as well in order for them to sort of adapt to the modern warfare, which they just got a taste of fighting each other. The only nations that had these colorful uniforms entering World War I were the French and the Belgians, and that was a well, it didn't last very long, as they figured out very fast that with artillery barrages, aircrafts, and other scouts, it would be very, very easy to spot the French and the Belgians pretty much immediately as soon as they entered the field. Not much changes in the interwar and World War II era. The time of the military fatigues that we've gotten used to stick around, and they stay for a very important reason. After World War I, much of Europe was completely changed, and a lot of these nations, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, France, a lot of the Balkan nations, Russia, they lost their monarchies. They were deposed of, or they lost a great amount of power. And they did not want to return to an era of this monarchy-dominated aristocratic society. Many of these new regimes, which were Republican, fascist, Nazi, and communist, wanted to stick to their workers' roots, their civilian roots of the people rising up. Now, there were some retention of more traditional values with military uniforms. One of the big ones being medals, of course, which have been around since the Roman times. These medals were used in order to distinguish certain things that the soldiers would do in combat, would distinguish their rank, their honors, bravery in battle, and such. And these would be donned on their uniforms in order to showcase some of that prowess. There's an example here we have of the German uniform. We have a more traditional Western European front, and we have a North African front. We have the different hats that would be used during this conflict. We have different symbols that would be on the arms and the helmets. We have many, many different ranks and medals. And it would be an easy way for anybody in the German army, or for any military that follows a similar pattern, to easily look at a soldier, identify who they are, what they've done, and where their placement on the pecking order is. And this would essentially be the same for the entirety of the interwar and World War II era, with one little exception, and that's with the production increase of World War II. Now, they've had a lot of time to actually make these uniforms. They were cut a lot better for the troopers back in World War I, since this was all new technology. These helmets, these uniforms were being cut for a one-size-fits-all model. And there was still a little bit of that in World War II, but the silhouettes of the uniforms are very iconic, that even if you look at a black silhouette, you can immediately identify that's a Russian Soviet soldier. You can see from the Ushanka, the long coat, that's a British soldier. They have the Brodie helm. They have their particular wider uniforms, their wider fatigues. And of course, Germans going with a very slim, very sleek, thin outline and silhouette. Once we get into the modern era is where I would say one of the biggest changes happens. Every era before this has had something in common, and that is each uniform is distinguishable and it's easily recognizable. Even in times of Rome, the different ranks and different Roman legions would have different identifying things about them. You know, the Germans, they had their pickle helms. The British, they had the Brodie helms and their red coats. The French, they wore blue a lot, and they had their Adrian helms. They all had things that you could look at that and immediately know where it was from. Once we get into the modern era, as we can see, we have these abundance of camouflage, extreme practicality uniforms that don't serve any other purpose than to just be effective in combat. And this would advance more and more as body armor started to come back in a new form with Kevlar. Kevlar is not the same as metal armor like iron or steel. It's not super, super expensive or super, super heavy to carry around, but it is very, very useful, very lightweight, easy to move around in. And it sort of brought a new era of uniform and armor back to fighting. In addition to that, with World War II and World War I, we've had entire vehicles that were designed to be essentially a giant set of armor, tanks, trucks, that sort of thing. That's how uniforms and armor has advanced throughout history, how it's changed and how it's adapted to modern warfare. But I wanted to go over some specific points of each era that I particularly enjoyed, and I think not a lot of people know about. And we'll find out about that in segment 2. So, uniforms have been around for a long, long time, and they've all have a particular story about them, and of course, reasons why they changed in the first place. Let's start with Rome. The Roman legions, they're iconic for their reds and their steel armor, they're almost skirts or kilts, their ornate helmets. Rome was a society that was based a lot on symbolism. Symbolism played a very important part. The role of the emperor was important, and the role of Rome itself as a society was important. So Roman legions had this idea of Rome itself to fight for. And so they're not really representing themselves, they're representing Rome. And so the uniforms here are super, super standardized. They're super, super identifiable, but there is room for individuality, such as with centurions and higher ranks being able to show off a little bit more of their experience and prowess. Very interesting idea that would come out of this is the war trophy, or sort of the war memento, something that you find during combat that you keep on you. There's many instances of this in modern time. Think of Vietnam. You have soldiers that are wearing things from Vietnam or from home that aren't part of their uniform, but they have it as a sort of identifier of who they are. I'm sure you've seen the helmets with the writing on the sides and the front. But enough of the Roman legions. They're the most standardized, the most uniform of the uniforms. In the Middle Ages, of course, we get the iconic metal armor that we've seen with the Templars, the Knights of Yore, King Arthur and such, these fantastical tales of men traveling across Europe on their horses to slay for religious valor or such. Now, one might think that metal armor would be a total cheat code in the uniform game, that it would completely stop any sort of battle from progressing at all, as it would just deflect everything off. But there are ways around it. Many developments were made during the Middle Ages towards the classical era and to the modern era, which would completely phase out armor from being effective at all. You have spears that can pierce certain weak points. You have crossbows that can completely shatter through certain armors and render them useless. And of course, with the advent of ballistic weaponry, gunpowder, it would make armor pretty much useless for the next few centuries. In the early modern era, this is the time of the regimented uniforms. You have colors for certain ranks, you have colors for certain nations. This era is probably my favorite, as it allows for a lot of individual freedom, but also a lot of interdivisional freedom within the units. As you can see, there are dozens of uniforms here, most of which of the same nation, just doing different roles. The Navy has their own uniform, and different types of boats would have their own uniform. Different colonial enterprises would have their own uniforms. And it was a really easy way to identify who is doing what, who works for who, and who is in charge. Now, the iconic uniforms of the British and the Prussians cannot go understated, as I think when most people think of this era, they're thinking of the Redcoats, one of the most iconic uniforms in history. Now, the Redcoats was a British uniform designed for much of their history, mostly for their royal or their colonial enterprises. Now, with the American Revolution, there's many ideas of the Americans calling out the Redcoats because of how obvious their uniforms are. The red giving a very, very clear idea of where they were. And this, as I earlier explained, caused them to shift their focus from their uniforms, going from the bright, bright reds of the British Redcoats to a more subdued brown, green, and tan fatigues, which they would use in India, and then later Africa, and then later Europe, which would forever make the Redcoat nothing more than a symbolic uniform used for ceremonies or guarding civilian targets or royal targets, and not used on the front. So that's why that changed. Armor changed because of the advent of new weapons, which would render them useless. And the regimented, classical, colorful uniforms of old would be changed due to the increase of military tactics, more guerrilla, and more long-distance fighting. And of course, as I mentioned, World War I, the biggest example of uniform change on the planet is when everybody in Europe changed from the colorful colors back to the simple, depressing, and practical uniforms of their grays, their browns, their tans, and their greens to fit the war that they needed, which was trench warfare. You were getting dirty, and one wrong move would mean death. There wasn't much change from World War II to the modern era. Of course, symbolism changed. A lot of the uniforms had political symbolism on it. Instead of the symbol of the monarchy, like with World War I, where you had the eagle, which represented the German monarchy, and the Russian monarchy and the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, just depending on which nation you were fighting for. In World War II, a lot of the symbolism was political. You had the swastika and the eagle on a lot of German uniforms. You had the hammer and sickle on a lot of Soviet uniforms. British uniforms would still carry that sort of royal accenting on it, had the RAF symbol on it. The American uniforms used a lot of stars to represent the American flag, so on and so forth. And this would continue for a few decades until warfare got so precise, so serious in the Cold War and in the early supermodern era that, as I mentioned, it got regressed to the most practical form of uniform, which is just camouflage and Kevlar vests. There's no identifying features or symbols or iconography that would allow you to know what this unit, who they're fighting for. Sure, you might be able to tell from the weapons or from the specific type of uniforms they're wearing, certain cuts and all that, but it's very hard for the individual person, the average person, to identify who is fighting for who. It's very interesting with this modern warfare, especially now that a lot of modern warfare is not two nations fighting each other, but rather a lot of skirmishes. Think of the fighting in India, in the Middle East, in Africa. It's not a lot of super organized military forces. It's a lot of guerrilla forces, civilian forces, a lot of people that never signed up for the military prior to war. We don't have a lot of veterans, a lot of seasoned troops. And so these uniforms, they reflect that in the more civilian aspect to them. But those are the major changes that uniforms and body armor changed throughout history in order to fit modern warfare. Let's talk a little bit more about my favorite uniforms and thoughts in our third segment. So, off tangent a bit here, talking about my personal favorite uniforms, what they mean, and some of the iconography that I really admire and enjoy. I think the red coat is probably the best example of this. The red coat is so iconic. It's in plenty of different films and television shows and books, and it's just an iconic set of garbs that people would wear. And you immediately know what it is as soon as you see it. The red coat with that tall black cap and those brown breeches and those tall boots immediately symbolizes a royal sense, a sort of aristocratic upbringing, aristocratic service. And of course, this is true because the redcoats nowadays are really only a symbolic force in the British Royal Arms. I don't even think they are part officially of the Royal Arms, or at least not all of them, as they are employed from Buckingham Palace. I admire the regimental period quite a bit, as these uniforms are very snappy, very nice to look at, and they serve a valuable purpose of conveying information very, very well. Some of my best examples, I like a lot of naval helmets or hats and uniforms. The tricorn is iconic, of course. The Prussian uniform, that deep blue, is iconic for European uniforms. It was really the grandfather of the modern regimental uniform that would be used throughout the late 17th into pretty much the entirety of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. This Prussian blue would be adopted by many other nations, and the Pickelhaube was a staple of German pride and German iconography. It was also used by the Austro-Hungarians, but it was mostly a German invention. It's essentially the form of the redcoats for the British. The Pickelhaube in the dark blue was for the Prussians and later the Germans. World War II, I think, has a lot of interesting uniforms. I feel like World War I, their uniforms were a little bit too standardized. Again, they didn't really have the time or the money or the production to make these uniforms cut particularly well. I do, however, think that they are obviously practically very well. They work well in the trenches. They could get dirty and it's not a big problem. And they're meant to be workwear, not a ceremonial piece of clothing. But in World War II, the uniforms kind of went back to that regimental period, but instead of identifying the nation you were fighting for or the idea of the monarchy or such, it focused on the identity of the nation, the politics. Look at the Soviet uniforms. They have a lot of red and green, and they have the hammer and sickle. And they're very winter-oriented, obviously, being a very cold country. You look at that, and although there's not the colorful uniforms of the regimental era, you can still look at that and say, that is a Soviet uniform. It's brought back to sort of its easily identifiable period, like the regimental era. And then you look at the German uniforms. They were specifically designed to be attractive, to look good. This was their purpose. They were designed as a piece, as a sort of a bird buffing their chest out to say, look at this, we're back, and we've got style, and we've got a strong armed forces. It was a psychological move. When you get to the Americans and the British, they were a little bit more subdued. These uniforms are more what would later become a more modern uniform, the camouflage that we're used to. But that makes sense, as the British and the Americans weren't exactly a political regime as extreme as the Soviet Union or Germany. Even something like Japan has a lot of interesting symbolism and a lot of practical uses, being that Japan is in East Asia. A lot of their fighting was on very, very hot and very humid islands. Their uniforms were super, super thin, super, super lightweight, maybe a tunic and some pants and a hat with a cap to cover the back of your head, protection from the sun, and honestly, from disease and wildlife, which would be a far more dangerous and likely more common than any gunfight would, as much of the island fighting was done later in the war anyways. It's a lot of uniforms for this episode, but I guess the main takeaway I wanted to bestow upon the viewer is that uniforms, they're not just clothes that you wear on your back. And armor, it's not just protection from guns or swords, but it is a piece of warfare, the same as propaganda, the same as war marches. They're a symbol of a nation and a symbol of the era you're fighting in. Each era that I've talked about has a very, very specific style, very different from the others. And they easily identify themselves, and they have a certain level of class and purpose in that era. After ballistic weapons were invented, we didn't need body armor, so they made uniforms that fit a symbolic use. In World War I, sight lines and hiding from the enemy was super important, so they changed to a subdued design to fit the practical use of that warfare. And now in modern era, we have camouflage and we have Kevlar, which completely surrounds you in essentially a camouflage suit that shows no identifiable features to a potential enemy, completely hiding you, or at least who you are. But that's all we have for this episode of Theaters of War, where we talked about uniforms. We look forward to seeing you next week, which would be our final episode, where we talk about war goals and war justification.